$50, her brother said, and he didn't even look at her when he said it. He held his hand out to the fat man with the gold tooth and the smell of cheap whiskey, and Clara Whitmore stood there with her wrists already tied and her mouth already bleeding, and she understood in that single breath that she had never been a sister to this man. She had always been a transaction waiting to happen. The fat man reached into his coat. Clara looked at the rope around her wrists, and she decided she would rather die on this road than walk through that door alive. If this story moves something in you, if you believe that a woman's worth was never something another man had the right to name, stay with me until the very end. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The rope bit into her wrists every time the wagon hit a rut, and the road from the Whitmore homestead to Red Hollow was nothing but ruts. Clara had been counting them. Counting them the way a person counts breaths when they're trying not to scream. Not because screaming would help, but because the impulse to make noise was the last thing she had left that belonged entirely to her. Her brother Holt sat up front with the reins loose in his hands and a bottle between his knees. He hadn't spoken to her in 2 hours. That was fine. Clara had nothing to say to him that wouldn't end with her voice cracking, and she refused to crack in front of Holt Whitmore. She had decided that on the day their father died. She had held herself together through the burial, through the bank letter. Through the morning, she came downstairs and found 3 men she didn't recognize sitting at her kitchen table, while Holt told her she didn't need to worry about what they were discussing. She had held herself together through all of it. She would hold herself together now, but her hands were shaking. She looked down at them and hated them for it. Holt. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Holt, stop the wagon. He didn't answer. I said stop the wagon. Look at me. Just look at me and tell me this is something you can live with. He took a pull from the bottle. Holt. She leaned forward as far as the rope allowed, and the wood of the wagon seat dug into her knees, and she made herself keep her voice level, even as something behind her ribs was pulling itself apart. We can figure another way. I can work. I've been working the farm alone for 3 years, while you ran up your debts. I can work somewhere else. I can. You think I didn't try? He finally turned his head, and what she saw in his face was worse than cruelty. It was exhaustion. The look of a man who had already finished grieving a decision he'd made 3 days ago. Dawson wants $200 by Friday, or he sends men to burn the property. You understand, burn it, while we're still inside. Then let it burn. That's Pa's land. Pa is dead, Holt. He turned back to the road. Well, so is every other option. Clara sat back and pressed her bound hands against her stomach and breathed. She breathed the way her mother had taught her, slow from the belly in through the nose and out through the mouth. Her mother had called it the prayer breath. She'd said God listened better when you weren't shouting at him. Clara wasn't sure she believed that anymore, but the breathing still helped. The wagon rolled on. Red Hollow appeared in the distance as a smear of lamplight against the darkening sky, and Clara studied it with the calm of someone taking inventory. 2 main streets. Saloon on the corner, she could see the sign even from here, hand-painted in crooked, reading, Malone's in letters that dripped like the painter had been drunk. A stable to the left. A general store shuttered for the evening. A jail with a dark window. A church at the far end of the street that looked like it hadn't seen a congregation in some time. She was still cataloging exits when Holt pulled the wagon to a stop outside Malone's and climbed down without helping her. The man who came out to meet them was not what she had imagined. She had built a monster in her mind during those 2 hours of silence, large, obvious, the kind of violent that announced itself. Victor Malone was none of those things. He was small and neatly dressed, with a carefully trimmed mustache and patient eyes, and the soft hands of a man who let other people do his physical work for him. He looked at Clara the way a person looks at a piece of furniture they've been quoted a price on, considering the craftsmanship, estimating how long it would last. She's healthy, he said to Holt. She's standing right here, Clara said. Malone's eyes moved to her face without hurry. I can see that. Then you can ask me. A pause. A thin, unhurried smile. "Are you healthy, Miss Whitmore?" "I'm healthy enough to testify in a federal court about what's happening on this street right now." Holt grabbed her arm so hard her shoulder screamed. "Stop it! Let go of me!" "Clara." "I said let go." She wrenched sideways and lost her balance and went down onto one knee in the dirt, and she was up again before Holt could grab her a second time. But he caught her by the collar of her coat and the fabric tore at the shoulder, and she drove her elbow back into his ribs, and he let go with a grunt, and then she was running, hands still bound in front of her boots, slipping on the packed dirt, running without a plan, except that Malone's front door was not a door she was willing to walk through. She made it 6 steps before one of Malone's men stepped out of the shadows and caught her by both arms and lifted her entirely off the ground. She kicked, she thrashed, she screamed because it turned out the impulse hadn't left her after all, and the scream that came out of her was not the cracked, pathetic thing she'd feared, but something raw and furious and real, something she had been swallowing for 3 days and possibly for years. It changed nothing. The man held her until she stopped moving, and then he set her down facing Malone, and she stood there breathing hard with dirt on her knees and her coat hanging off one shoulder. And Malone looked at her the same way he had before, still considering, marginally more amused. "She's a fighter," he said to Holt, as though this were a feature worth pricing. "She'll calm down," Holt said. "I will not calm down," Clara said. "I want you to hear me clearly, both of you. Whatever you're planning, I will make it as difficult as I possibly can for as long as I live, and I will find every legal authority in this territory, and I will—" "There's no legal authority in Red Hollow," Malone said pleasantly. "Sheriff Briggs and I have an understanding." The bottom dropped out of her stomach. She had been counting on the law. She realized it only now. She had been running scenarios in her head for 2 hours, and every one of them ended with a lawman, a courthouse someone official, who would look at what was happening and put a stop to it because that was how things were supposed to work. The law existed. The law was supposed to mean something. But Sheriff Briggs and Victor Malone had an understanding. She felt the fight go out of her legs, and she had to lock her knees to stay standing, and she hated herself for it, even as she understood that it was just physics. It was just her body processing information. It didn't mean she was surrendering. It didn't mean anything except that she was standing on a street in a town with no law, and her hands were tied, and the man who was supposed to be her brother was counting $50 into a stranger's palm. "50," Holt said. He pocketed the remaining bills without looking at her, turned toward the wagon. "Holt." Her voice barely carried. "Holt, look at me." He stopped with his back to her. "Look at me," she said. "Please. Whatever happens to me after tonight, whatever you hear happened, I want you to see my face right now so you know exactly what you chose." A long moment. The wind moved down the street and lifted the dust around their feet. Holt Whitmore climbed up onto the wagon seat and picked up the reins and drove away without looking back. Clara stood outside Malone's door with the rope on her wrists and her coat half torn from her shoulder and the sound of her brother's wagon wheels fading into the dark. And she understood something she had never understood before. That there were some losses so complete they didn't feel like loss at all. They felt like a door closing quietly, like a part of the world simply becoming smaller. She was still standing there, very still, very quiet, when a new sound came down from the ridge. Hoofbeats, single horse, moving fast. The rider came down off the ridge the way trouble usually did in the territory, without announcement, and with a certainty of purpose that made the people on the street step back without quite knowing why. Malone's man, the one who'd grabbed her, moved his hand toward his hip, stopped, moved it back. The horse was a dark bay, enormous, blowing hard from a run. The man on its back pulled up short 12 feet from where Clara stood and looked at the scene in front of him with the kind of unhurried assessment that didn't need anyone to explain it to him. He saw the rope. He saw Malone's hand still extended from counting money. He saw Clara's torn coat and the direction her brother's wagon had gone. He didn't say a word for a long moment. Clara looked at him, the way you look at anything when you've already run out of hope. and something new appears on the horizon, with a caution so deep it was almost indistinguishable from suspicion. He was tall. She registered that first. Lean, but wide through the shoulders, the build of a man who worked with his body without thinking about it. His face was weathered in a way that put him somewhere past 40, with deep lines around his eyes, and a jaw that looked like it had been set against something difficult for a very long time. He wore a Colt on his right hip and didn't touch it. "Malone," he said. His voice was low, the kind of low that doesn't need volume to fill a space. Victor Malone turned with his pleasant smile already arranged. "Kane, I didn't know you were in town." Passing through. The man Kane had not taken his eyes off Clara. "What's on the girl's wrists?" "Private business." "Doesn't look private." Malone's smile held. "I'd encourage you to ride on. I've known you 11 years, Victor." Kane's voice didn't change, didn't harden or sharpen or do any of the things angry voices usually did. It just settled, like something heavy being set down on a table. "I've watched you run this street for 11 years. There's not one thing I could say about your operation that would surprise a federal judge. You know that, and you know I know it." A pause. "So we can do this one of two ways," Kane said. "You can tell me the figure you paid for the girl. I'll double it. You walk away with more money than you started with, and nobody has to have a conversation they'll regret." Malone's smile thinned. "And the second way?" "I don't think you want to know the second way, Victor." Clara stood very still. She had the strange, dissociated feeling of watching a thing happen that she had not participated in deciding. This man Kane had ridden down from a ridge and was now negotiating for her like she was a parcel that had changed hands. She should have been furious. She was furious. She was also underneath the fury, something that she couldn't name yet, something that felt embarrassingly close to relief, and she hated herself for that even more. $100, Malone said. Kane reached into his coat and produced a folded billfold, counted out bills without taking his eyes off Malone's face. "There's $150. The extra $50 is for your trouble." Malone took the money, looked at it for a moment, nodded to his man. The man who'd been holding Clara stepped forward and produced a knife and cut the rope from her wrists, and the blood rushing back into her hands was so sharp and sudden that she nearly gasped. She clenched her fingers instead, pressed her nails into her palms, held herself together. Malone went inside. His man followed. The door closed. Clara stood on the empty street and looked up at the man who had just paid $150 for a woman he had never met, and she felt the dangerous thing rise up in her throat again. Not tears. She would not cry. She absolutely would not, but something fierce and unmanageable. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said. Kane looked at her from the horse. "All right. I mean it. I don't know you. You could be worse than he was." "Could be. So what do you want? Why did you do that?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he swung down from the horse in one smooth motion and stood there in the street, not moving toward her, keeping a deliberate distance between them. "I was riding past," he said. "I saw what was happening. I could have kept riding." He glanced down at the severed rope in the dirt, then back up at her. "I didn't." "That's not an answer." "No?" He agreed. "It isn't." He picked up the rope from the ground and held it for a moment, then dropped it again. "I'm not going to tell you what to do, miss. You can walk into that saloon, you can walk down that road, you can sleep in the stable tonight if you want. It's none of my concern. But I have a ranch about 4 hours north of here, and there's a spare room and the lock is on the inside of the door. That's the only offer I'm going to make." Clara studied him. She had learned to read men quickly. She'd had to living alone on a farm with a brother who brought different kinds of trouble home every season. This man was not performing. That was what she kept coming back to. He was not performing concern or performing safety. He was just standing there in the dirt being exactly what he appeared to be, which was a tired man who had done a thing and was now leaving the consequences of it up to her. She rubbed her wrists. The skin underneath was raw. "What's your name?" she asked. "Elias Kane." "You own a ranch?" "Cattle. Up in the mountain valley, 8 men on the payroll. Why are you riding alone through Red Hollow at this hour? Something moved behind his eyes. Just a flicker quickly gone. Longer story. I have time. I know you do. He looked at her steadily. Do you have somewhere else to go tonight, Miss Whitmore? Clara Whitmore. She said it deliberately. Her name was her name, and she would say it out loud to every stranger she met for the rest of her life, because Holt had tried to make it currency, and it was not currency. It was hers. And no, I don't have anywhere else to go. He nodded once, reached into his coat, pulled out his canteen, and held it toward her at arm's length without moving any closer. There's water, when you're ready. She looked at the canteen for a long moment. Then she took it. The ride north took just over 4 hours, and Clara spent most of it awake on the back of a borrowed ranch horse that Elias had procured from the Red Hollow stable, paying the nightman out of the same billfold that had already been considerably lightened. He didn't make conversation, and she didn't either, and the silence between them was not comfortable exactly, but it was honest, which was more than most silences she'd sat in recently. She thought about Holt, the way you probe a sore tooth carefully to assess the damage. The image of his back as he drove away kept returning. She let it. She didn't try to make it hurt less or mean something different than it meant. Her brother had sold her for $50. He had looked at 20 years of shared meals and shared grief and shared labor under their father's roof, and he had decided that $50 was the fair exchange. She filed that information away in the part of herself that kept facts without flinching, and told herself she would figure out what to do with it later when she had somewhere to stand. The Kane Ranch came into view just before midnight, and Clara absorbed it with quiet attention. It was larger than she'd expected. Not elaborate, no fancy porch, no decorative trim, nothing that existed for reasons other than function, but solid. The kind of structure that had been built to outlast the people who built it. She could see the cattle barn, the bunkhouse, further out a cookhouse with a low light still burning. A dog barked twice and went silent. Elias dismounted and came around to hold her horse's head while she climbed down. He didn't offer his hand, and she didn't need it, and they both seemed to understand that without discussing it. Cookhouse should have something left from supper, he said. I'll get Rosa. Who's Rosa? My housekeeper. She has been here 12 years. She'll show you the room. He paused, and she could see him choosing his next words with some care. In the morning, if you want to talk through what comes next, I'll be here. If you don't want to talk, and you'd rather just figure it out on your own, I'll leave you to it. Either way's fine. Clara looked at him in the thin moonlight. Why are you doing this? She said, not accusing, genuinely asking. Because my wife used to say that doing the right thing was mostly just noticing when somebody needed something, and then not pretending you didn't notice. He paused. She was better at it than I am. The past tense landed quietly between them. She passed, Clara said. 4 years ago. He handed her the horse's lead and moved toward the house. Come in when you're ready, Ed. She stood in the yard for a moment after he went inside. The mountains were enormous and black against the sky, and the air was cold in a way that felt clean instead of punishing. And the dog, a gray shepherd, she could see it now lying beside the cookhouse door, lifted its head and looked at her without alarm. She walked toward the light. Rosa Delgado was a small, dark-haired woman in her 50s who appeared in the kitchen doorway, tying her robe without any expression of surprise at finding a stranger in her yard at midnight. She looked at Clara's torn coat and raw wrists and said nothing about either. She said, "Sit," and pointed at the kitchen table. She put a bowl of cold bean stew in front of Clara and a piece of cornbread and a tin cup of water, and she sat down across from her and folded her hands and waited. Clara ate 3 bites before she started shaking. It was not what she expected. She had been holding herself together for so many hours that she had started to believe the holding was permanent, that some new version of herself had calcified around the grief and the fear and the fury, something hard and unbreakable. But apparently the food had opened a door, or the kitchen table had, or the specific quality of Rosa's stillness, the complete absence of pity in her eyes, even though the knowledge was clearly there. Something opened a door, and what came through it was the shaking. Clara set down her spoon and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Rosa watched her without moving. "I'm all right," Clara said. "I know you are. I just—" She stopped, started again. "My brother sold me tonight for $50. She said it the way you say a thing out loud to make it real, to test whether saying it changes the weight of it. It didn't. $50. Rosa was quiet for a moment. Then she said in the matter-of-fact tone of a woman sharing an ingredient, rather than a wound. "My first husband sold me to a ranch owner in Sonora when I was 17, for a horse and a saddle." Clara looked at her. "It was a very good saddle," Rosa said. Something in Clara's chest wound so tight for so many hours that it had started to feel structural released just slightly. Not enough to matter, just enough. She picked up her spoon again. "How did you get here?" she asked. "That," Rosa said, "is a very long story. There will be time for it." She stood and picked up the bowl that Clara had nearly finished and replaced it with a full one without asking. "Tonight you eat. Tomorrow you sleep. The day after that you decide what kind of woman you're going to be." "I already know what kind of woman I am." Rosa looked at her across the table with those dark, unsurprised eyes. "Then you already know what you're going to do." Clara ate the second bowl of stew in silence, and somewhere between the last bite and the moment Rosa showed her to the room at the end of the hall, the one with the window that faced the mountain and the lock on the inside of the door, exactly where Elias Kane had promised it would be. She understood that whatever she had lost in that street in Red Hollow tonight, she was not among the things she had lost. She was still here. She was still her. And nobody, not Malone, not Holt, not the fat man with the gold tooth who had reached into his coat for $50 and come up short, had managed to take that. She turned the lock, lay down on the narrow bed without undressing, stared at the ceiling, and somewhere in the dark, and the quiet, and the clean mountain air coming through the cracked window, something that had been clenched for a very long time began very slowly to unclench. She was still thinking about the way Elias Kane had said "my wife" when she fell asleep. He had not said "my late wife," or "the woman I lost," or any of the gentle distancing phrases that people used to describe a grief they had organized and put away. He had said "my wife," present tense in his mouth even though she was 4 years gone. The way a person speaks about a place they still consider home even though they don't live there anymore. She didn't know yet what to do with that. She slept. Outside the window, the Montana mountains held their silence, and the Kane Ranch breathed around her, the way old solid things breathe slow and deep and without apology. And 3 miles back down the road toward Red Hollow, in a saloon with a crooked painted sign, Victor Malone sat at his desk and looked at $150 and thought about Elias Kane and what it meant that a man like Kane had ridden down from a ridge for a woman he didn't know. He thought about it for a long time. Then he called for a pen and paper and began writing a letter. She lasted 3 days in that room before the stillness started to feel like a different kind of trap. It wasn't that the room was unwelcoming. Rosa had put a second blanket on the bed without being asked, and the window faced east, so the morning light came in clean and direct, and nobody knocked unless they had a reason. It was the stillness itself that was the problem, the way it gave her nothing to push against. Clara Whitmore had spent her entire adult life in motion. Cooking, mending, planting, hauling water, keeping books for a farm that barely broke even while her brother ran up debts she didn't know about until the letters started coming. Motion had been her armor. Stillness left her alone with the things she hadn't had time to think about yet, and she wasn't ready for those things. On the 4th morning, she was in the kitchen before Rosa arrived. Rosa stood in the doorway and looked at the biscuits already browning in the cast iron and the coffee already on the heat, and Clara already elbow-deep in the bread dough, and she said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Clara said. "I wanted something to do." Rosa came and stood beside her, and they worked in silence for a while, The comfortable kind that two women who understand physical labor fall into without negotiating it. After a time, Rosa said, "The men eat at 6. How many mo? 8 on the payroll, sometimes 9 when Elias hires seasonal. Any preferences I should know about?" A pause. "You're not here to cook for them. I know that too." Clara pressed her knuckles into the dough. "But I'm here, and the food's being made, and I'm not going to sit in a room and wait for my life to figure itself out." She looked at Rosa sideways. "Unless Elias has a problem with it." "Elias Kane," Rosa said with the tone of a woman who had observed a man long enough to know him precisely, has not expressed a preference about his kitchen in 12 years. The first morning, the ranch hands came in for breakfast and found 2 women. Instead of one, the silence that fell over the table had texture to it. Clara stood at the stove with her back straight and her expression neutral and let them look. She had been looked at by men who were deciding what she was worth, and she had been looked at by men who were deciding whether she was dangerous, and she had learned to tell the difference. These men were doing something closer to the second thing, which was at least honest. A man named Cord. Big, red-bearded, the kind of loud that was habitual rather than aggressive. Said to no one in particular, "So the boss brought home company." "The boss brought home a guest," Rosa said from the other end of the kitchen without turning around. "Same thing." "It is not the same thing," Rosa said. "Sit down and eat your breakfast, Cordell." Cord sat. But he watched Clara with the particular wariness of a man whose routine had been disrupted, and Clara recognized the type well enough to know that the wariness was not personal. It was territorial. The way a dog watches a new dog enter the yard, and that the best response to it was no response at all. She served breakfast. She kept her eyes level and her hands steady, and she spoke when spoken to, and otherwise said nothing, and by the end of the meal, Cord had eaten 3 biscuits and said grudgingly that they weren't bad. "High praise," said a younger man across the table, and a few of the others laughed and the tension broke. The way tension usually breaks, not all at once, but in pieces. Elias ate at the far end of the table, and he watched all of this without comment. Clara didn't look at him directly. She could feel him watching, and she filed it away for later consideration, the way she filed everything carefully without yet deciding what it meant. After breakfast, when the men had gone and Rosa was clearing, Clara sat down across from Elias with a cup of coffee she didn't particularly want and said, "How long are you planning to let me stay?" He looked up from the ledger he'd been going over. "I wasn't planning a limit." "That's not practical." "Maybe not." He closed the ledger, set his coffee down. "You got somewhere you need to be?" "No." "Then there's no practical problem yet." She studied him across the table. "You don't know me." "I know enough." "You know I'm the woman your money bought out of trouble on a street in Red Hollow." "That's not the same as knowing a person." Something moved in his face, an acknowledgement of accuracy, without conceding the point. "What would you like me to know?" he said. She hadn't expected him to turn it back on her. She picked up her coffee and held it without drinking. "I was a farmer," she said. "Before all this, I managed our property for 3 years after my father died, while my brother ran debts I didn't know about. I can keep books, I can run a kitchen, I can work cattle if you need me to. I'm not afraid of hard labor." She set the cup down. "I'm not a charity case." "I didn't say you were." "People are thinking it." "People think a lot of things." His voice was even. "The ones who work for me think what I let them think. If I say you're a guest, you're a guest. If I say you're something else, you're that." He paused. "What would you like to be?" Clara looked at him for a moment. "Useful," she said. "I'd like to be useful, that's all." He nodded once, opened his ledger again. "The books for this property haven't been touched in 3 months. If you can manage figures, Rosa knows where they're kept." She picked up her coffee. It tasted better than it had a minute ago. My, 3 weeks passed. The way time passes in places built around physical rhythm fast because the days were full. Slow because each day resembled the last. Clara found her footing on the Kane ranch, the way you find your footing on uneven ground, by moving carefully, until the ground became familiar, and then less carefully, and then not thinking about it at all. She took over the books. 3 months of uncategorized receipts seed costs recorded in 2 different hands, a payroll that had been calculated correctly, but written down in a way that made the tax liability almost impossible to assess. She spread everything across the kitchen table on a rainy Tuesday, and didn't look up until Rosa came in with supper and said she'd been at it for 8 hours. The previous bookkeeper didn't understand inventory offsets, Clara said. The previous bookkeeper was Elias, Rosa said. Clara looked up. Oh. Rosa set down the plate. He's better with cattle than columns. I can see that. Clara looked back at the papers. He's been overpaying his feed supplier by about 11% for 2 years. Rosa made a sound that might have been a laugh. Tell him that. I intend to. She told him that evening after supper, standing in the doorway of the room he used as an office with the relevant receipts in her hand, and she walked him through the arithmetic, the way she would have explained it to her father directly, without softening it. Because men who worked land understood that numbers were not personal. They were just information, and information was useful. Elias listened without interrupting. Looked at the receipts. Looked at her calculation. Then he said, "Who taught you figures?" "My mother." And then practice because nobody else was going to do it. He was quiet for a moment. The supplier's name is Grant. Ezra Grant. He's been doing business with this ranch since before I inherited it. That doesn't change the arithmetic. No, he said. It doesn't. He looked at the receipts again. I'll talk to him. You could also just stop using him. He glanced up at her. He's got 3 children. Clara considered this. You could talk to him, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, just barely. That's what I said. She put the receipts on his desk and went back to the kitchen, and she realized halfway down the hall that she had not thought about Holt for the entire day. She stopped, noticed it, let it be what it was. Not a betrayal of grief, not a closing of a door, just a day where other things had taken up the space. She filed it and kept walking. The trouble with Cord started on a Thursday. Clara was in the stable working with a young horse that had been spooked by something and hadn't come right since she'd been spending an hour each morning talking to it. Nothing deliberate, just presence and voice the way her father had taught her when Cord came in looking for a halter and found her there. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he said, "You know horses." "My father did. I learned what I could." Cord walked past her to the tack wall unhurried and took down a halter. On his way back he stopped, looked at her in a way that was not hostile exactly, but was measuring in a way she didn't like. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and it's not my business, but I've been on this ranch 5 years and I knew Elias Kane's wife, and I've watched this man for 4 years work himself half to death, because when a man's carrying that kind of grief, he needs something to carry instead, and I just want to know what you are to him." Clara kept her hands on the horse's neck. "A guest?" she said. "That ain't what the men are saying." "The men can say what they like. The men are saying he bought himself a woman and he's too proud to admit it." Clara turned and looked at Cord directly, and she kept her voice level and her expression neutral, the way she had learned to do, but underneath that, there was something that felt like a hot coal in her chest. "Then the men are wrong," she said. "And if you want to know what I am to Elias Kane, you could try asking Elias Kane." A pause. "I'm asking you," Cord said. "I know you are." She turned back to the horse. "I'm choosing to answer the way I answered." Cord stood there for another moment. Then he walked out. The horse pressed its nose against Clara's hand, and she breathed, and the hot coal in her chest cooled slowly down to something manageable. That evening at supper, Elias sat down across from her and said without preamble, "Cord told me what he said to you." Clara looked up. "I told him," Elias continued in the same level tone he used for everything, "that you are a guest on this property, that you are under my protection, and that the next man who speaks to you with anything less than basic respect will find himself looking for work somewhere else." Clara set down her fork. "You didn't need to do that." "I know I didn't." I can handle cord. I know that too. He picked up his fork. I didn't do it because you couldn't handle it. I did it because it was the right thing to do. He paused. There's a difference. She looked at him for a moment. He was already looking at his plate. She picked up her fork and went back to eating, and tried to ignore the way that conversation had settled into her chest like something solid and warm in a place that had been empty for a long time. It was Rosa who noticed first. Clara was in the cookhouse one morning 2 weeks after that, making the ranch hands breakfast the way she now did every morning by choice, when a smell hit her from the frying pan that she had smelled 1,000 times before without consequence. Her stomach turned over. She set down the spatula, gripped the edge of the work table, and breathed through it until it passed. Rosa appeared in the doorway. Clara did not look at her. "The coffee's done," Rosa said. "In a minute." A silence. "Clara?" "In a minute, Rosa." Rosa came into the cookhouse and stood beside her and said nothing. And the nothing she said was the kind that understood. Something had just changed and was giving it room. Clara kept her hands on the table and her eyes on the middle distance and waited for the nausea to subside completely, and when it did, she straightened up and picked up the spatula and turned the bacon. "It's been 6 weeks, Rosa said quietly. "I know." "Does he know?" The bacon sizzled. Clara watched it carefully. "No." "You're going to have to tell him." "I know that too." "The longer you wait." "I know, Rosa." She turned from the pan. Her voice was under control, but her eyes, she suspected, were less so, and she let them be because Rosa was not Cord and was not anyone she needed to manage. "I know what the longer you wait means. I know what all of it means." She turned back to the bacon. "The child's father died in November. He was a railroad man named Thomas. We were going to be married in the spring." A pause. "He came down with fever on a stretch of track in Wyoming and was dead in 4 days. I didn't find out until January when his foreman sent a letter." Rosa said nothing for a long moment. "Then in February," Clara said, "I realized I was carrying his child. And I told Holt, because he was the only family I had, and 3 weeks later he put me in a wagon." The silence in the cookhouse was very complete. "I thought Malone's was better than nothing," Clara said. "Which tells you something about how far down I'd already gone." "Clara, I'm all right." She moved the bacon off the heat. "I'm figuring out what to do. I just need a little more time." "Elias Kane," Rosa said carefully, "is not a man who will throw you out for this." "You don't know that." "I've known him for 12 years. You don't know what he'll do with this specific thing." Clara started plating the food. "Nobody knows what they'll do until they're standing in front of it. That's not a criticism of him, it's just true." Rosa stood beside her for a moment longer. Then she picked up 2 of the plates and carried them toward the main house without another word. Clara stood alone in the cookhouse with her hand resting for just a moment flat against her stomach. Thomas. His name was Thomas. He had laughed easily and worked hard and spoken about their future with the calm confidence of a man who believed the future was a place you could plan for. She had believed it too for a little while. She had believed it right up until the letter from Wyoming arrived, and the floor of that belief dropped out from under her, and she had stood in her father's kitchen. The kitchen she had been running alone for 3 years, and understood that she was 24 years old and alone and pregnant, and the only person left who was supposed to help her had just watched her become a transaction. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach. Then she picked up the remaining plates and walked toward the main house. Elias was already at the table with his coffee and his ledger the way he was every morning now, and he looked up when she came in, and something in her face must have said something she hadn't meant to say, because he watched her cross the room with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You all right?" he said. "Fine," she said. "Eat your breakfast before it gets cold." He looked at her for one more moment. Then he looked at his plate. And Clara sat down across from him and poured her own coffee and thought about Rosa's words. He is not a man who will throw you out for this, and felt underneath the fear that had been sitting in her stomach for 2 months. something she had not let herself feel since November, the smallest, most fragile thing. The first thread-like filament of something that might, if she was very careful, if she let it grow instead of pulling it up before it could take root, might become hope. She was still thinking about how dangerous that was when Elias closed his ledger, looked across the table at her and said quietly, "Clara, whatever it is you're not saying, when you're ready, I'll still be here." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them said anything else. But the silence between them had changed shape, and she felt it, and she knew that he felt it too, and that the time she had been asking Rosa for was running shorter than she'd thought. Because some things once seen cannot be unseen. And Elias Kane, she was beginning to understand, was a man who noticed things and did not pretend otherwise. She was out of time. She just didn't know it yet. She told him on a Sunday, not because Sunday felt right, but because Sunday was the one day the ranch hands didn't start until late, and the house was quiet enough that she couldn't use noise as an excuse anymore. She had been using noise as an excuse for 11 days since Rosa had stood beside her in the cookhouse and said the words she already knew. 11 days of finding reasons to be in motion, to be useful, to keep the books or the kitchen or the conversation moving fast enough that there was never a clean opening for the thing she needed to say. On Sunday morning, she came downstairs, and Elias was already at the kitchen table with his coffee, which was normal, and he looked up when she came in, which was normal. And the particular quality of his attention, still patient, not demanding anything from her, was the thing that finally made it impossible to keep waiting. She sat down across from him. She did not pour coffee. She folded her hands on the table and looked at them for a moment, and then looked at him and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything." He set down his cup. "All right. The man I was going to marry died in November. A railroad worker named Thomas Hale. Fever on a work camp in Wyoming. We weren't married yet. We'd planned for spring." She kept her voice level. She had rehearsed this in the dark for 11 nights, and the rehearsal had not made it easier, but it had made it organized, and organized was what she had. "I found out in January that he was gone. I found out in February that I was carrying his child." She paused. "I told my brother. 3 weeks later he put me in a wagon." Elias said nothing. His face said nothing. She kept going. "I am somewhere between 3 and 4 months along. I didn't tell you when I arrived because I didn't know you, and I have learned not to hand people information they can use against you before you know what they intend to do with it." She looked at him directly. "I'm telling you now because it's the right thing to do. Because you've been honest with me and you deserve honesty back. And because—" She stopped for just a half second. "Because I cannot keep eating your food and sleeping in your house and pretending I am simply a woman who needed somewhere to land when the truth is more complicated than that." The silence that followed was the longest she had sat in since the night Holt drove away. Elias looked at his coffee cup. He turned it once in his hands. Then he looked up at her and asked the one question she had not prepared for, the one question in 11 nights of rehearsal she had never once thought to script an answer to because nobody had ever asked it before. "Do you want this child?" The words hit her somewhere behind the sternum. Not painfully. The way a door hits when someone opens it. A shock of air, a sudden change in pressure, a world becoming larger than it was a moment ago. She had been asked what she was going to do about the child. She had been asked how she intended to manage. She had been asked in the few weeks between February and the wagon whether she had considered her options, whether she understood her situation, whether she appreciated the difficulty she was creating. Nobody had asked what she wanted. She felt her throat close. She pressed her lips together hard and breathed through her nose and absolutely refused to cry, and she managed it for about 4 seconds before her eyes filled anyway, and she was furious at herself for it, even as she understood there was nothing to be done. "Yes," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she meant it to. "Yes, I want this child. This child is the last thing Thomas left in the world, and I—" She stopped, pressed her hands flat on the table, steadied. "Yes." Elias nodded. He was quiet for another moment. Long enough that she began to brace herself. began to construct in the back of her mind the shape of her next move, the direction she would walk, when he told her she needed to find another arrangement. Then he said, "Then marry me." Clara stared at him. "Let the child have my name," he said. His voice had the same quality it always had, direct, unhurried, not performing anything. "Let the world say whatever it wants. It will say things regardless. But a child with Kane's name on this property has a future. A child without it has a harder road, and that's not the child's fault, and I won't be the man who lets that stand when I can do something about it." "That's—" She stopped, started again. "That's a pity offer." "Is it? You feel sorry for me?" "I feel a number of things about you," he said. "Pity is not a strong one." "Elias, I'm a practical man," he said. "I don't make impractical offers. If I thought this was a bad idea, I wouldn't have said it." He looked at her steadily. "You keep my books better than anyone has in 6 years. You run this kitchen without being asked. You talk to my horse, the bay gelding, the one nobody else can get near, and he comes to you like a dog. You walked into this house with nothing, and in 6 weeks you've made it feel like a home again." He paused. A brief thing waited. "I haven't said that to make you feel obligated. I said it because you asked me if this was pity, and I want to be precise about what it isn't." Clara looked at him for a long time. "I don't love you," she said. Not cruelly, just honestly, because he was an honest man and he deserved it back. "I want to be clear about that. I think you're a good man. I think you're probably one of the best men I've met. But I don't love you, and I don't know if I'm capable of it right now, and you should know that before you say anything else." "I know that," he said. "You can't want to marry a woman who doesn't love you. I've thought about it more carefully than you might expect." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "My wife and I grew up 2 farms apart. I knew her my whole life before I knew I loved her. Love is not always the thing that comes first." He looked at her with that steady, undemanding attention. "What comes first is choosing to try." The coal in her chest, the one she had been tending carefully, too carefully, afraid to feed it, and afraid to let it go cold, flared without warning. She stood up from the table. She walked to the window and stood with her back to him, because she needed 30 seconds where he couldn't see her face, and she gripped the windowsill and breathed, and the thing in her chest burned, and she let it burn, because it was better than the alternative, and she had been cold for so long. "Give me some time," she said finally. "You have as much as you need." She heard his chair push back, his footsteps across the kitchen, the back door opening, and then just before it closed, his voice one more time, quiet without pressure, the way he said everything. "Whatever you decide, Clara, you and the child stay. That's not conditional on anything." The door closed. She stood at the window for a long time after that. She was still turning his offer over in her mind 4 days later when the first sign of trouble came from a direction she hadn't expected. It was young Miguel, the Mexican stable boy she'd been teaching to read, 12 years old, and sharp as a new blade, who earned his keep by sleeping in the stable loft, and knowing everything that moved within 2 miles of the ranch, who came running into the kitchen just before supper with his boots unlaced and his eyes wide and said, "Miss Clara, there was a man at the south fence today asking about you." Clara set down the pot she was holding. "What kind of man?" "Town man. Not a rancher. He had a good coat." Miguel caught his breath. He asked old Pete if the woman Elias Kane brought back from Red Hollow was still here. Pete told him to get off the property. A pause. But Miss Clara, he didn't look like he was going to stop at one question. She stood very still. "Did you tell Elias?" "I came to you first." "Tell Elias," she said. "Right now. Go." Miguel went. Clara stood in the kitchen with her hands very steady and her mind moving fast and clean, the way her mind moved when she stripped everything else away and just worked the problem. Someone from Red Hollow had come looking, which meant Malone knew she hadn't walked back through his door, which meant Elias's $150 had bought her less time than she'd thought, which meant the letter she had seen Malone reach for that night, The pen and paper she had not been close enough to see had gone somewhere. Elias came in 2 minutes later with Miguel on his heels and Cord right behind him. "Tell me," Elias said. She told him. Straight through, no softening. When she was done, he looked at Cord and said, "Double the fence watch tonight. Jeb and Santos on the north approach you and Danny on the south." "You think they'll come tonight?" Cord said. "I think they'll come when they think we're not expecting it. Which is why we'll be expecting it." He looked at Clara. Something in his face had changed, not to fear, she realized. To focus. The kind of focus that meant a man had assessed a situation and moved past the question of whether it was serious straight to the question of what to do about it. "You'll sleep in the main house, room next to Rosa's." "I'm not going to hide Elias." "I know you're not. I'm asking you to be somewhere defensible, not somewhere hidden. There's a difference." His eyes held hers. "Can you shoot?" "My father taught me. I haven't in a few years." He went to the cabinet in the hallway and came back with a small revolver and set it on the kitchen table between them. "Then spend an hour tomorrow morning remembering." She looked at the gun, looked at him. "All right," she said. He nodded, turned to go. "Elias." He stopped. She held herself very straight. "This is because of me. Whatever comes through that fence is because of me." He turned back, and his expression was the most direct she had ever seen it. "It is," he said. "And I need you to understand that doesn't change a single thing about what I said 4 days ago." He walked out. Cord looked at Clara with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the measuring wariness of the first weeks, not territorial suspicion. Something that was, unless she was reading it entirely wrong, close to respect. "For what it's worth," Cord said. "I was wrong about what I thought." He picked up his hat from the table. "And anybody who comes over that fence is going to have a very bad night." He left. Clara picked up the revolver, checked the cylinder the way her father had taught her, methodically, deliberately, without rushing. It was loaded. She set it back down on the table. Then she walked to the window and looked out at the dark. They came on a Thursday night 3 days later in the rain. Clara heard the first shot from the south fence before she was fully awake, and she was on her feet and dressed before the second one, the revolver already in her hand, moving down the hall toward the front of the house, the way Elias had walked her through twice along the wall low away from the windows. Rosa was already in the hallway. "Stay back from the glass," Clara said. "I know," Rosa said. She had a shotgun. Clara did not ask where it came from. The voices outside were not trying to be quiet anymore. She could hear Cord shouting something from the south and return fire, and then boots on the porch steps, and she pressed herself against the wall beside the front door and waited, and her hands were not shaking. And she noted that with a cold, clear corner of her mind as something to think about later. The front door came open hard. The man who stepped through it was not anyone she recognized, hired muscle, the blank professional kind. Not personally angry, just doing a job, and he had a pistol up and was moving fast, and Clara stepped out of the shadow beside the door and put the revolver 6 inches from his face and said, "Drop it." He stopped. He looked at the gun, looked at her, made a calculation. He dropped it. "On the floor," she said. "Hands where I can see them." He went down. She kicked his pistol away and kept hers level and said to Rosa over her shoulder, "There'll be more." And Rosa said, "I know." And Clara felt underneath the cold, clear focus something extraordinary, the absence of fear. Not bravery exactly. Just the absence of the specific fear that had been living in her chest since the night in Red Hollow, the fear of being taken, being handled, being someone else's decision. That fear was gone. She was standing in this doorway with a gun in her hand, and she was nobody's transaction. Outside, the rain came down, and the shots continued, and she heard Elias's voice, the low, carrying voice that didn't need volume somewhere off the porch, and she heard him say, "You sold your sister once. Try taking her again, and I'll bury every man standing beside you." She knew that voice. She had heard it in Red Hollow, on a dark street from the back of a dark horse. The voice of a man who had assessed a situation and moved past whether it was serious. And then through the rain, through the noise, through the particular stillness in her own chest, she heard her brother's voice answer back. "She's not your concern, Kane. She became my concern the night you left her in the dirt for $50, Holt." A pause. The rain. "The man she owes is Malone," Holt said. "This isn't... She doesn't owe Malone anything. I paid Malone. Malone took the money, and he took his chance. And this is what comes after taking a chance that doesn't pay." Elias's voice had not risen. It had, if anything, gotten quieter. "Go home, Holt, while you still have legs to walk on. There are 6 men behind me." There were 8. Cord's already dealt with 2 of them. A beat. "Go home." Clara crossed to the window, not close enough to be visible, just close enough to hear clearly. She could see the shape of Elias on the porch, the shotgun in his hands, the rain running off the brim of his hat. She could see the dark shape of her brother in the yard below him, smaller somehow than she remembered, like grief had contracted him. "Holt!" Her own voice surprised her. She hadn't meant to speak, but she was at the window and the window was open, and his name had come out of her before she decided it should. He looked up. She could see his face in the dark, and it looked the way it had looked when they were children, and he'd broken something, and their father hadn't found out yet that specific combination of guilt and defiance that had never quite resolved itself into either. "Whatever Malone's paying you, whatever debt he said he'd clear, it won't hold. Men like him don't clear debts. They just trade them." A long silence. "You don't know that," Holt said. "I've been keeping books for 6 weeks, she said. "I know exactly what a ledger looks like when someone is managing you instead of paying you. Go home, if you have a home left." She paused. "And don't come back." The silence stretched. Then one by one the shapes in the yard began to move, not toward the house, away from it. Slowly the way men move when they've decided something without saying it out loud. Holt stood there the longest. Then he turned and walked away into the rain. Elias stood on the porch until the last sound of hoofbeats faded. Then he lowered the shotgun and turned and looked at the window where Clara was standing. And even in the dark and the rain, she could see the expression on his face. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter and more complicated, the expression of a man who had done what needed doing and was already thinking about what came next. Clara pulled back from the window. She stood in the middle of the room with the revolver still in her hand and Rosa somewhere behind her and the man on the floor not moving, and she felt something move through her. Not the hot coal, not the fragile thread of hope from Sunday morning. Something older and deeper. The specific understanding that comes when a person has been through something real and come out on the other side of it, changed. Nobody had ever fought for her before. Not once in her entire life. Her father had loved her, but he'd been sick and tired, and the farm had taken everything he had. Thomas had loved her, but he'd died before he had the chance. Holt had been supposed to, and he had not. The world had been very consistent on the question of who was supposed to protect Clara Whitmore, and its answer had always been nobody in particular. Figure it out yourself. And here was this man, this tired, careful, unhurried man who had paid $150 for a woman he didn't know on a street in Red Hollow, standing in the rain on his porch with a shotgun, telling her brother that she had become his concern. She set the revolver on the table. She walked to the front door and opened it. Elias was still on the porch, his back to her, looking out at the yard. He didn't turn around when she came out, but she knew from the slight shift in his posture that he was aware of her. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No, there was a man inside. He's on the floor. Cord'll deal with him." He paused. "You all right?" She stood beside him and looked out at the dark yard and the rain, and she thought about Sunday morning and the offer she had asked for time to consider, and the 11 days of rehearsals, and the question nobody had ever asked her before, and the answer that had cracked her open when she said it. "Yes," she said. A long quiet. "Elias." He turned and looked at her, and she held his gaze, and said the thing she had been turning over for 4 days with all of its weight and all of its risk fully acknowledged, "I'll marry you." He looked at her for a moment. "Not because I need to," she said. "Because I'm choosing to." There's a difference. The corner of his mouth moved, the same small, barely there thing she had seen once before across a ledger in his office. "I know," he said. "That's the only way I would have wanted it." The rain came down around them, and somewhere in the bunkhouse, Cord was laughing about something, and the Kane Ranch breathed its slow, solid breath, and Clara Whitmore stood on the porch of a house that was not yet hers, and felt for the first time in a very long time like she was standing exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not know yet what was coming. She did not know about the blood, or the cold, or the night in January when Elias Kane would collapse beside a bed and whisper things into the dark that a man only says when he believes he is about to lose everything that matters. She did not know any of that. What she knew was this: she had walked through a door she had not chosen, and she had found on the other side of it something nobody had thought to tell her existed, a man who noticed things and did not pretend otherwise. That was enough to begin. Orchestrated emotional narrative arc spanning marriage, childbirth crisis, and paternal breakdown. Orchestrated emotional narrative arc spanning marriage, childbirth crisis, and paternal breakdown. They married on a Friday in October, 3 weeks after the rain and the men in the yard, and Holt's retreating shape disappearing into the dark. There was no ceremony worth calling one. A circuit judge named Halverson came through Red Hollow the second Friday of every month, and Elias rode down on a Thursday evening and arranged it, and came back and told Clara over supper, and she said, "Tomorrow then," and he said, "Tomorrow." And Rosa looked at both of them across the table with the expression of a woman who had been watching two people arrive at an obvious conclusion, and had the grace not to say so out loud. Cord pressed a clean bandana into Clara's hand, the morning of, without explanation, then walked back to the stable. She looked at it for a moment. Then she tucked it into her coat pocket and rode down to Red Hollow beside Elias, and said her name clearly when the judge asked for it, and signed the paper with a steady hand, and Elias signed beside her, and that was that. On the ride home, he said, "Is there anything you need from town? Anything we didn't think of?" She considered it genuinely. "Fabric," she said. "The baby will need things, and I haven't sewn in months." He nodded. "We'll stop at the general store." They stopped at the general store. He paid without looking at the price. She chose practical things. Cotton wool flannel, good thread, and the woman behind the counter looked at Clara's ring, and then at Elias, and then back at Clara, with the specific expression of a small-town woman performing arithmetic she had already completed, and Clara held her gaze until the woman looked back down at her counter. On the way out, Elias held the door. It was such a small thing. She almost didn't catch it. But she did, and she filed it, and it joined the growing collection of small things she had been filing about this man, the way he never stood close without being asked. The way he said her name exactly once, and then waited for her to respond, rather than repeating it the way he had left the revolver on the kitchen table after the night with the men in the yard, and said nothing about it being there, and nothing about taking it back. Small things. Patient things. The architecture of a man who had learned somewhere along the way that respect was not a speech you gave, but a habit you kept. She was still quiet on the ride home, and he let her be quiet, and by the time the ranch came into view, she had decided something not dramatically, not as a revelation, just the way you decide something when you've been thinking about it long enough that the decision is simply the next logical step. She would try, not to perform trying. Actually try. Open the door that she had been keeping latched on the inside since November, and let whatever was going to grow there have the light it needed. It was the most frightening decision she had made since sitting across the kitchen table and telling a man she barely knew that she was carrying another man's child. She made it anyway. The first weeks of their marriage were careful in the way new things are careful, not uncomfortable, just deliberate. They moved around each other with the attention of two people who were aware that the rules had changed and were taking time to understand the new ones. Elias did not change his habits, and neither did she, except that now when he came in from the evening round and she was still at the kitchen table with the ledgers, he pulled out the chair across from her instead of going directly to his office, And sometimes they talked about the books, and sometimes they talked about other things, and sometimes they said nothing at all. But the nothing was a shared nothing, which was different. He told her about the war on a Tuesday night in November without preamble, the way you tell a thing when it's been sitting behind your teeth long enough that it simply comes out. He had been a Union man, though he said it without pride or apology, just as a fact. He had come back from it in 1865 with both legs intact, and something in his chest that wasn't, and he had spent the following 3 years working his father's land and not talking to anyone about it until he met a woman at a church social who had looked at him across a room and said with the directness of someone who knew exactly what they were seeing, "You're carrying something heavy, that's all right. I'm strong." He said his wife's name, Marin, and Clara heard how it came out, not with the careful distance of a grief that had been organized and put away, still present, still close. What was she like? Clara asked. He thought about it honestly. Stubborn, he said. Funny. She could read a man's character in about 4 minutes, and she was never wrong about it. He looked at his coffee cup. She would have liked you. Clara wasn't sure what to do with that. Is that hard? She asked. To say. He looked up at her. Which part? Any of it. A pause. It used to be harder, he said. It's gotten to where I can hold it without it breaking something. He set down the cup. Grief does that if you let it. It stays the same size, you just get bigger around it. She thought about Thomas, about the particular shape of that loss, not the enormous, devastating grief of a long marriage, but the grief of a future that had been planned and then canceled, the grief of the version of herself that had believed in that future and was now walking around in a present that felt like the wrong room. I'm still getting bigger, she said. I know, he said. You're doing fine. It was not a comforting thing to say, in the way that comforting things are usually said soft-edged and warm and designed to make you feel better immediately. It was just an observation. True and direct, and offered without asking anything in return, and it hit her somewhere below the sternum, and stayed there. She went to bed that night thinking about Elias Kane, who had been stubborn and funny, and had looked at a damaged man across a room, and told him his weight was something she could manage. She thought about that woman with something that was not jealousy. She was certain of that, or mostly certain, but a kind of understanding, the recognition of a quality she had encountered before, in women who knew what they were doing and were not afraid of the difficulty of it. She thought you left him in good hands. She surprised herself by meaning it. December came in cold and hard, the way Montana. Decembers had a way of doing, not gradually. Not with warning, but as a simple fact of geography, the mountains deciding that warmth was finished, and there was no point in discussing it further. The ranch contracted inward. The hands spent more time in the bunkhouse. Rosa made soup that lasted 3 days. Elias added a second morning round to check the cattle coming in red-faced and deliberate, shedding his coat at the door the way he always did. Clara was 7 months along by December and moving differently, which she found irritating in a way that was almost useful. The physical inconvenience of it gave her something concrete to push against when the emotional things got complicated. She kept the books. She kept the kitchen. She taught Miguel to read well enough that he had finished the 2 books she'd brought and was demanding a third, which she found so satisfying that she spent an entire evening writing a list of titles for Elias to find in town. He came back with 6 books. Miguel looked at them like a man who has been given a weapon and is deciding how to use it. Clara looked at Elias over the boy's head. Elias looked at the ceiling. She laughed a real laugh, the kind that comes from a place below performance, the kind that surprised her. And his face did the thing it sometimes did, the small movement at the corner of his mouth. And she thought, there it is. That is what this man looks like when he's happy. She filed it with everything else she had been filing. That night she lay awake listening to the wind and thinking about what it meant to choose a person. Not fall into them she had fallen into. Thomas helplessly and completely, and without thinking about it, the way you fall into something that catches you entirely off guard. This was different. This was a choice she made with her eyes open, knowing the cost, knowing the weight of what had come before on both sides. Knowing there was no version of this that didn't require her to be deliberate every single day. She put her hand on her stomach. The baby moved. "All right," she said quietly. To the dark, to the child, to herself. "We're going to be all right." The snowstorm started on the 14th of January, and it did not stop. Clara woke at 3 in the morning with a pain that pulled her out of sleep so completely that she was sitting up before she was conscious, and she understood immediately and without panic what it was. She had spoken to Rosa about this. Enough times, had asked every question she could think of, had gone over the order of things so many times that the knowledge was organized and accessible, even in the dark and the cold, and the 4 inches of new snow already against the windowsill. 6 weeks early. She got up, put on her robe, walked down the hall and knocked on Rosa's door. Rosa opened it already dressed. "How far apart?" Rosa said. "I don't know yet. It just started." Rosa looked at the window, at the snow, at Clara. "I'll send for the doctor." "In this storm." "I'll send Danny. He knows the road." Danny went. They all knew without saying it that the doctor was 12 miles through a blizzard, and that 12 miles in January was not a number you relied on. Rosa had delivered babies before she said this plainly, without drama in the kitchen, while the water heated 3 of them on her family's rancho in Sonora, and 1 here 2 years before Clara arrived, a ranch hand's wife who had gone early and been fine. Clara held on to the kitchen table during the next pain and breathed and did not make a sound. And Rosa watched her with those dark, steady eyes and said, "Good, like that. Keep breathing like that." Elias appeared in the kitchen doorway. He had clearly dressed in a hurry shirt, half-buttoned boots, unlaced, and he looked at Rosa and then at Clara, and his face did something she had not seen it do before. It went very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. The way a man goes still when he has encountered a situation that his competence cannot fully address, and he is making himself absorb that fact. "The doctor," he said. "Danny's gone," Rosa said. "Come here and be useful, or go somewhere else." He came in. He sat beside Clara and said nothing, and she was grateful for the nothing. She held his hand during the next pain without meaning to. She reached for the table edge, and his hand was there instead, and she gripped it, and he let her, and did not wince, though she was not being careful. The hours that followed were the longest of Elias Kane's life. He knew this while they were happening, not in retrospect. He sat beside Clara in the room at the end of the hall, the room with the window that faced the mountain and the lock on the inside, and he listened to her fight, and Rosa moved around them both with the efficiency of a woman doing a job she understood, and the snow came down outside, and the doctor did not come. 3 hours in, Clara said through her teeth, "Talk to me. Say something. Anything." Elias said, "The first summer I ran cattle on my own, I lost 40 head to a storm. My father said he said the measure of a rancher wasn't how many he kept. It was whether he got up and counted the ones that were left." He kept his voice even. "You're counting," he said. "That's all you're doing. Just count the ones that are left." She looked at him. Her face was exhausted and fierce and entirely present. "That is the strangest thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. "Probably." She almost laughed. Then another pain took over, and she gripped his hand again, and he held on, and Rosa said, "Clara, now, with me." The child came just before 6 in the morning. The silence that followed the 2 seconds of silence before the sound was the worst thing Elias Kane had ever lived through, and that was a list with significant entries on it. He did not breathe. He did not think. He simply existed in those 2 seconds and waited. Then the baby cried. Elias let out a breath that had approximately 4 years and 11 months of everything accumulated in it. "A girl," Rosa said. She had already wrapped the baby and was moving with purpose, and Elias had 1 second to register the child small, impossibly small, furious, alive, before Rosa said his name in a different tone. He looked at Clara. Clara was the color of the bedsheet. Her eyes were open, but her breathing had changed, and Rosa said without looking up from what she was doing, "Elias, Hold her hand and talk to her. Don't stop talking." He moved. He took both her hands. He leaned close and said her name, and she looked at him, and her eyes were present but distant. The way eyes get when a person is fighting something that is happening inside them that nobody on the outside can reach. "Clara." He kept his voice level by force of will that he would not remember exercising. "Stay with me. You hear me? Stay right here." "The baby," she said. "The baby is fine. The baby is right here with Rosa. I need you to stay with me." "Is she?" "She's perfect. She's angry and she's loud and she's perfect." He squeezed her hands. "Clara, look at me, right here." Her eyes focused on his face. "There you are," he said. "Stay." Rosa worked. The fire burned. The snow came down outside. And Elias Kane sat beside the bed with both of Clara's hands in his and talked about the ranch, about the cattle, about the summer, the creek flooded, and Cord built a raft and went down it on a dare. About the morning he had ridden past a street in Red Hollow and seen a woman with rope on her wrists and a fire in her eyes and made a decision in about 4 seconds that had turned out to be the best decision of his life. He talked, and Clara listened, and her color came back by degrees, slowly, the way light comes back after a cloud passes. By the time the doctor arrived 2 hours late, half-frozen, deeply apologetic, Rosa had already handled everything that needed handling, and Clara was sleeping, and Elias was sitting beside the bed with the baby in his arms, looking at a face that was approximately 2 hours old and already had opinions about everything. The doctor examined both of them, said Clara had lost significant blood and would need rest and careful watching, but would be all right. Said the baby was small but healthy and strong. Said Rosa had done exactly the right things at exactly the right times, and that he was going to go tell his wife that story when he got home. After the doctor left and Rosa went to sleep, and the house settled into the particular quiet of a crisis that is resolved. Elias sat alone in the chair beside Clara's bed with the baby, asleep against his chest. Clara woke just before noon. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, orienting herself, and then she turned her head and found Elias there, still in the same chair, the baby in the crook of his arm, a man who had not slept and who wore the evidence of the night's hours in every line of his face. "You're still here," she said. Her voice was barely audible. "Where else would I be?" She looked at the baby. "Is she?" "Sleeping. She ate an hour ago. She has very strong feelings about being hungry." He adjusted the bundle in his arm carefully. "She looks like Thomas," he said. "Around the eyes." Clara went still. "Is that—" he started. "No," she said quickly. "No, it's not. I just—" She stopped, breathed. "Thank you for saying that." He nodded. She reached out her hand. He leaned forward and placed the baby in her arms, and she held the child. Her child. Thomas's child. The child who had survived a brother's betrayal, and a street in Red Hollow, and a blizzard and a night that had nearly taken them both, and her face did the thing faces do when they are feeling something too large and too real to have a single name. Elias watched her, and his own face did something she had only ever seen it do once before on the porch in the rain when she had told him she would marry him. Not the small movement at the corner of his mouth. Something larger. Something unguarded. "You came here thinking I saved your life," he said quietly. His voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with tiredness. "But Clara—" He stopped, looked at the woman and the child in front of him, and said the truest thing he knew. "You saved mine." Clara looked up at him. She had kept careful account of everything this man had done and said and chosen since the night in Red Hollow. She had filed it all catalogued, it examined it in the dark, with the deliberate attention of a woman who did not trust easily and who had good reasons not to. She had built a picture out of small things, his patience, his directness, the books for Miguel, the hand she had grabbed in the night without meaning to, the voice that had kept talking when she was fighting something nobody else could reach. She had been getting bigger around the grief. She had not noticed until this moment that something else had been growing in the space the grief left behind. "I know," she said softly. She was not talking about the same thing he was. He understood that. She could see it in his face, that steady, unhurried recognition, the face of a man who noticed things and did not pretend otherwise. "What are you going to name her?" he said. Clara looked down at the baby. The baby opened her eyes, dark, uncertain, taking in the world with the fierce concentration of someone who had arrived somewhere difficult and intended to make the most of it. "Grace," Clara said. "Her name is Grace." He was quiet for a moment. "Why Grace?" She looked at him. This man she had chosen, with her eyes open. This tired, careful, honest man who had sat beside her bed all night in a chair and held her hands and talked about cattle so she would have something to hold on to. "Because that's what she is," Clara said. "What both of you are." She held his gaze. "Grace, I didn't earn and didn't expect and couldn't have planned for." She paused. "The best things never are." Outside the window, the snow had finally stopped, and inside the room that had once been just a room with a lock on the inside of the door, Elias Kane reached out and put his hand over Clara's, over the baby between them, and held on. Not because she needed him to, not because she couldn't manage without it, but because she had let him, and that was the whole difference, and both of them knew it. Grace Kane had been in the world for 6 hours. She had already changed everything in it. Grace Kane learned to walk on a Tuesday in September and fell down 7 times before she decided that falling was simply part of the process and stopped treating it as a problem. Elias watched her from the kitchen doorway that morning with his coffee going cold in his hand, and Clara watched him watch her, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing to say, that the moment wasn't already saying better. Grace pulled herself up on the leg of the kitchen table, took 3 steps, sat down hard on the floor, looked at both of them with an expression of pure assessment, and then got back up again. "She's stubborn," Elias said. "She gets that from her mother," Clara said. He looked at her sideways. "She gets that from everybody in this house." Clara picked up her coffee and didn't argue, because he was not wrong. Grace grew the way children grow in hard country. Fast, practical, unafraid of the things that frightened other children because she had been raised in a house where difficulty was something you named clearly and then dealt with rather than something you walked around. By the time she was 2, she was following Miguel through the stable, asking questions he couldn't always answer. By 3, she had opinions about horses that Cord took seriously enough to argue with. By 4, she could read haltingly determinedly with the same expression her mother wore when working through a problem in the ledgers, and she carried books around the ranch the way other children carried toys. Clara watched all of this and felt something she had no single word for. It was not simply love, though it was that. It was the specific satisfaction of a woman who had been told by circumstance, by her brother, by the accumulated weight of everything Red Hollow represented, that she was finished, that her future had already been decided for her, and who had looked at that verdict and built something anyway. She had been building for 4 years. She was not finished building. The idea for the boarding house came to her in the spring of Grace's 2nd year. The way most of Clara's ideas came not as a sudden inspiration, but as the logical conclusion of a problem she had been turning over for months. She had been corresponding with 3 women she'd met through the circuit judge's wife. Women traveling west alone. Women between situations. Women who had written to Mrs. Halverson because they had heard through the particular telegraph of women's networks that operates entirely below the notice of official channels, that she knew someone in the mountain valley who might help. Mrs. Halverson had sent the letters to Clara. Clara had answered all 3. 2 of the women had arrived at the Kane Ranch within the month, and Rosa had put them in the East Room and the storeroom respectively, without anyone asking anyone's permission, and Elias had come in from the morning round to find 2 strangers at his kitchen table and had looked at Clara and said, "Are we expecting more?" "Possibly," Clara had said. He had poured himself coffee and sat down and introduced himself to both women by name and asked where they'd come from and what they needed, and Clara had watched him do it, watched him ask questions with that same direct, unhurried attention. He had once turned on her, the attention that assumed a person was worth knowing before they had proven it, and she had felt the thing in her chest that had no single word for it settle into something very close to certainty. She had made the right choice. Not just about him, about all of it. About staying, about trying, about letting the door open. She told him about the boarding house idea that same evening. He listened to the whole thing. He did not interrupt. When she was finished, he said, "How many rooms at?" "4, maybe 5 if we convert the storeroom properly. We'd need to extend the east wall." "I know. Cord can do it. He built his own house in Billings before he came here." He picked up his coffee. "I'll talk to him tomorrow." Clara looked at him. "You're not going to ask me whether this is practical?" "You keep my books," he said. "If you thought it wasn't practical, you wouldn't have proposed it." He set down the cup. "I'll ask Cord tomorrow." She had learned in 4 years to receive things without arguing against them. It had taken considerable practice. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her with that steady, unhurried attention. "You built this place back into a home," he said. "Build it into whatever else you want. I'll get the lumber." The boarding house opened in the summer of its first year with 4 rooms and a hand-painted sign above the door that said simply, "Whitmore House." Because Clara had kept her name as a middle name, Clara Whitmore Kane, and because the women who came here needed to see a woman's name above that door, not a man's, even a good man's. No woman was turned away. That was the only rule that never bent. Widows came. Young women traveling alone came, the ones who had started west with a husband and arrived without one and had nowhere to go from the crossroads. Women running from men came, those ones Clara met at the door herself always, and she looked them in the eye the way Rosa had once looked at her across a kitchen table, with the complete absence of pity, and said, "You're safe here, come in." Word traveled the way word travels in the territory, along wagon roads and through general stores, and in letters passed between women who had never met, but who understood that certain information needed to move carefully through channels that men were not monitoring. Within a year, women were arriving who had heard about Whitmore House from as far as Billings and Missoula. Within 2 years, people in Red Hollow had taken to calling Clara something she found both flattering and faintly embarrassing. She was in the general store in town when she overheard it for the first time, 2 women talking near the dry goods, not aware she was on the other side of the shelf. "You heard about the Kane Ranch, the boarding house?" "Everybody's heard. They're calling her the Angel of Red Hollow." A pause. Then, "Well, she earned it." Clara picked up her flour and went to the counter and said nothing about it. On the ride home, she told Elias, and he said without looking up from the road, "Marin would have hated that." "What?" "Being called an angel. She said angels were useless because they just observed things and looked pretty. She said she'd rather be called useful." Clara thought about it. "That's the best thing anyone has ever said to me." "I know," he said. "That's why I said it." She reached over and put her hand on his arm, and he put his hand over hers without looking, and they rode the rest of the way home like that, and Grace fell asleep against Clara's side with a book still open in her lap, and the Montana mountains held their enormous silence around them. And it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and also the best thing Clara Whitmore Kane had ever had. Holt came back on a Wednesday in April, 5 years and 2 seasons after the night in the rain. Miguel saw him first. He was 17, now no longer the boy from the stable loft, but a young man who worked the ranch full days and read everything Clara put in front of him, and had recently told Elias he wanted to study law, which had made Elias look at Clara, and Clara look at the ceiling, and both of them feel something enormous and uncomplicated. And Miguel came to Clara in the kitchen and said, "There's a man at the gate. He says his name is Holt Whitmore." The kitchen went very quiet. Rosa stopped what she was doing. 2 of the boarding house women at the table went still. Grace looked up from her book. Clara set down the bowl she was holding. "Go inside, sweetheart," she said to Grace. "Mama." Inside Grace. Grace went. Clara dried her hands on her apron and walked to the front of the house, and behind her, she heard Rosa say quietly to the room, "Finish your breakfast," and the sound of chairs settling and forks resuming. Holt Whitmore was standing at the gate with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who had rehearsed something and was no longer confident it would come out right. He was thinner than she remembered. His coat was the wrong weight for the weather, which meant it was the only coat he had. He had the particular stillness of a man who has been hungry enough times that he has stopped spending energy on anything that wasn't necessary. Clara stood on the porch and looked at him across the yard. He looked back. "Clara," he said. "Holt. He stopped, started again. "I don't have any right to be here." "No," she said. "You don't." He flinched, just slightly. "I know." "Then why are you—" He turned his hat in his hands. "Because I've been everywhere else," he said. "I went back to the homestead. Bank took it. I went to Billings looking for work, spent 8 months on a cattle drive that ended in a lawsuit when the owner died owing 6 months of wages. He stopped. His jaw worked. "I've been sleeping in livery stables for 2 months, Clara. And I know I got no right. I know exactly what I did. But you're the only family I have left, and I didn't know where else to go." The yard between them was very quiet. Clara looked at her brother, this man who had put rope on her wrists and taken $50 and driven away without looking back. And she did the thing she had been doing since the boarding house opened, the thing she had trained herself to do. She separated the person from the action. The action was unforgivable. She was not sure she had forgiven it. She was not sure forgiveness was the right word for what she was deciding. What she was deciding was something different. She was deciding who she was going to be. The screen door behind her opened. Elias stepped out. He stood beside her and said nothing, and his nothing was the kind that was entirely aware of the situation and was placing itself at her disposal rather than inserting itself into her decision. And she loved him for it, with a completeness and a certainty that she had arrived at so gradually she could not have said exactly when it became the truth, only that it had been the truth for long enough now that it felt like something she had always known. She looked at Holt. "The bunkhouse has an empty cot," she said. "There's work on this ranch if you want it. You eat with the hands. You keep your distance from the boarding house and the women in it." She paused. "And you don't get to call what happened between us settled just because I'm letting you stay. That's a longer road than one morning at a gate." Holt's throat moved. "I know. Do you?" "Yes." His voice had something raw in it now, something he was clearly not accustomed to letting out in daylight. "Clara, what I did. Not today," she said. "Today you come in, you eat something, and you rest. The rest of it starts when you're ready to be honest about all of it. Not before." She turned and went inside. Elias stood at the door for a moment and looked at Holt Whitmore, and Holt looked back at him, and a considerable amount passed between them without a word. Then Elias said, "You know how to mend fence?" "Yes," Holt said. "Court'll show you where. Come in after that and Rosa'll feed you." He turned to go inside, stopped, said without turning back, "She didn't do this for you, Holt. Understand that clearly. She did it for herself. Don't make her regret it." He went inside. Holt stood at the gate for a long moment. Then he came through it. The conversation with Holt came 6 weeks later on an evening when Elias had taken Grace to see the spring calves, and the house was quiet. Clara found her brother at the fence on the west side of the property, doing the methodical work of a man who had learned that being useful was the only currency he currently had, and she leaned on the fence post beside him and let the silence sit for a while before she spoke. "Tell me one thing," she said. "Not an apology, an explanation. Why didn't you ask me?" He looked at her. "When the debt got that bad, when Dawson was threatening the property, why didn't you come to me and say, 'Holt, we have a problem. What do we do?' Why was I never part of the conversation about my own life?" He worked the fence wire for a moment. "Because I thought," he started, stopped, tried again. "I thought if I told you how bad it was, you'd know how badly I'd failed. And I couldn't." His voice broke on the last word, and he didn't try to smooth it over, which was new and which Clara noted. "I was more afraid of you seeing what I was than I was of doing what I did, and that's—" He looked at her directly, and his face was doing the thing it had done at the gate, the raw, unguarded thing. "I know what that is. I know what that makes me." Clara looked at the mountains. "It makes you someone who made the worst choice possible because he was afraid," she said. "That's not a defense, but it's something I understand better than you might think." She paused. "I was afraid every day of the 4 months between Thomas dying and Red Hollow. I was afraid of what people would say about a pregnant woman alone. I was afraid of what my life was going to look like. Fear makes people do things they wouldn't otherwise do." She turned and looked at him. "That's not absolution, Holt. It's just the truth. You still have to live with what you chose." "I know. And you have to earn the right to be in my daughter's life, if you ever want to be. That's not mine to give. That's something you build over time." She pushed off the fence. "Rosa made stew. Come in before it's gone." She walked back toward the house, and she did not look back, and she did not feel the relief she had expected to feel. What she felt was quieter and more sustainable, not the hot release of a wound that had finally been opened, but the calm of a woman who had decided precisely who she was going to be and had acted accordingly. She had not forgiven him. She was not sure she ever would completely, but she had refused to let his choices determine the shape of her future, and that was the thing that mattered, and she had known it since the morning she stood in the cookhouse with her hand flat against her stomach and decided to be the woman who was still standing. Hank. It was Grace who saw her first. They were on the road back from Red Hollow on a Thursday afternoon in late summer, Elias driving Clara beside him, Grace in the back with a new book already open, when Grace said without looking up, "Papa, stop the wagon." "Grace." "Stop the wagon. There's a girl." Elias pulled the horse up. At the crossroads ahead. The same crossroads, the same dust, the same quality of late afternoon light that Clara had not thought about in years, but recognized instantly, in the way you recognize the smell of something painful from a long time ago. A young woman stood beside a broken-down wagon with 2 men on horseback beside her, and the particular stillness of someone who had exhausted all their options and was waiting to see which bad thing happened next. Clara was down from the wagon before Elias had finished stopping it. She heard him say her name, not alarmed, just present, letting her know he was right behind her, and she kept walking. The 2 men on horseback saw her coming and straightened. One of them had a hand near his belt. She paid attention to that and filed it and kept her eyes on the girl. The girl was young, 17, maybe 18, with travel-worn clothes and eyes that had been doing the same calculation Clara's had done 5 years ago on a street in Red Hollow, counting exits, finding none, arriving at the grim arithmetic of a situation with no good options. She looked at Clara, the way people look at anything when they've run out of hope and something new appears, with a caution so deep it was almost fear. "Will they hurt me?" she whispered. Clara took off her shawl and wrapped it around the girl's shoulders in one smooth motion. She did not look at the men, not yet. "What's your name?" she said. "Sarah," the girl said. "Sarah Monk." "Where are you from, Sarah?" "Nebraska. My father sent me with these men. He said they'd take me to work in Billings, but we haven't gone north. We've been going—" She stopped. Her voice had the same quality Clara's had once had, trying to stay level while something underneath it was pulling apart. "I don't know where we've been going." Clara turned and looked at the men on horseback. They looked back at her with the blankness of hired work, the professional remove of men who had decided that what they were doing was a job rather than a decision. And Clara recognized that remove and knew exactly what it was worth. "This girl is not going anywhere with you," she said. Her voice had the same quality Elias's had, the quality that didn't need volume. The one near his belt said, "Lady, this isn't. My husband is directly behind me." Clara did not turn around to confirm this, though she could feel that it was true. "My husband, in case you don't recognize him, is Elias Kane, who has been running cattle in this territory for 20 years, and who is personally acquainted with every law officer and federal judge in 100 miles. She paused. "And even if none of that were true, even if I were standing here alone, I would tell you the same thing." She held the man's gaze and did not blink. "This girl is not going anywhere with you, so you can make your decision accordingly." A long moment. The man looked past her at Elias. Whatever he saw there completed whatever calculation he was running. He pulled his horse around. The second man followed without speaking. They rode away. Clara listened to the hoofbeats until they were gone. Then she turned back to Sarah Monk, who was standing wrapped in Clara's shawl with tears running down her face, in the silent, exhausted way of someone who has been holding it together for too long. "It's all right," Clara said. "You're done holding it now." Sarah shook her head. I don't have anywhere." "Yes, you do." Clara put her hand on the girl's shoulder. "You're coming with us." "But I don't know you." "I know," Clara said. "That's all right. You'll know us." She looked the girl steadily in the eyes. "I'm Clara Kane. About 4 hours north of here, I have a house with a room in it and a lock on the inside of the door. You'll eat tonight and sleep tonight, and tomorrow morning we'll figure out what comes next." She paused. "Nobody is going to decide anything for you. Nobody is going to put a price on you. Nobody is going to touch you without your permission. Those are the only rules." Sarah Monk looked at her for a long moment. Then something in her face shifted. Not relief exactly, not yet, because relief required trust, and trust required time, and this girl had been given sufficient reason not to trust quickly. But the edge of it. The first thread-like filament. The door opening just enough to let the air through. "Okay," she whispered. Clara walked her back to the wagon. Elias came around from the other side and helped Sarah up without being asked and without making anything of it. And Grace scooted over and offered Sarah her book with the matter-of-fact generosity of a 5-year-old who has grown up in a house where women arriving with nothing was simply one of the things that happened, and Sarah took the book and looked at it, and then looked at this child who had offered it without any calculation at all, and her face did something complicated and quiet. Elias clicked to the horse, and the wagon started north. Clara sat beside him with her shawl gone, and the late afternoon light coming across the mountains, and Grace chattering behind them about the calves she had named without permission, and Sarah answering in a voice that was still careful, but getting slightly less so with each mile, and Cord would be at the ranch when they got back, and Rosa would have something on the stove, and Miguel was probably deep in a law book somewhere, and Holt was probably mending something he had broken, and trying to earn back a future he had forfeited. And the Kane Ranch was waiting for all of them in the mountain valley, where it had always been solid, unhurried, built to outlast the people who built it. Elias put his hand over hers on the seat between them. She turned her palm up and held on. "You know," he said quietly, "not for anyone but her. The day I rode down that ridge in Red Hollow, I thought I was doing something simple." "You were," she said. "I was wrong." She looked at the mountains ahead of them, at the road going north, at the life she had built out of a night on a street with rope on her wrists and $50 changing hands and a man on a dark horse asking for no explanation before he decided she was worth stopping for. "No," she said. "You were doing exactly what you thought, something simple." She leaned her shoulder against his. The rest of it was just what happened when two people decide to keep choosing each other. That's not complicated. That's just what love is. He was quiet for a moment. "When did you know," he said, "that you—" "The night Grace was born," she said. "When you kept talking. When you wouldn't stop talking." She paused. Nobody had ever done that before. Stayed that close when things were that bad. She turned and looked at him. This man, her husband, the one who noticed things and did not pretend otherwise, who had sat beside a bed all night talking about cattle and a flooded creek, and a decision he'd made in 4 seconds that had turned out to be the best one of his life. "I knew when you wouldn't leave." He looked at the road. "I wasn't going to leave," he said. "I know," she said. "That's when I knew." The wagon rolled north, and Grace fell asleep in the back, and Sarah Monk held a book she wasn't reading, and looked at the mountains with the eyes of someone watching a door she didn't expect slowly come open, and the Kane Ranch waited in the valley where it had always been. Clara Whitmore had arrived at a crossroads with rope on her wrists and nothing in the world that belonged to her. 5 years later, she was the woman other women ran toward when everything else had failed. She was the lock on the inside of the door. She was the shawl around the shoulders and the room at the end of the hall and the voice that said, "Nobody decides for you here." She was the woman the territory had tried to make into a transaction and had made into something else entirely, something it had not intended and could not undo. She was not the girl who had been sold. She was the woman who had decided every single day what she was worth. And no man, no debt, no crossroads, no blizzard, no night that tried to take everything. Nothing had ever been able to answer that back. Nothing ever would.